Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. I'm the host. Thanks for joining us. I've been away, as you may know, regular iNews viewers. I'm serving in my first year as a freshman in the Iowa Senate, and it's May 17th today, and got back a few weeks back to Iowa City. It's good to be back home. I want to thank Derek Maurer and Rusty Martin, two people that have been guest hosting the program. They've done a terrific job, and of course the crew who's always doing the heavy lifting around here. But it's great to be back, and we've got a terrific program for you this evening. In about a month or so, we're going to be voting on two constitutional amendments, changes to our Iowa Constitution, and that's the topic of tonight's program. We're going to get to that in a second. For you regular viewers, thanks for joining us. We are a statewide public access TV program seen in about 500,000 households every week, covering progressive content on state and local issues, and we hope you enjoy the show and share it with your friends. Now I'd like to introduce our guests. We have with us Art New, who's the former Lieutenant Governor, Mayor of Carroll, Iowa, former Mayor of Carroll, Iowa, former State Senator, and he's an attorney now living in Carroll and representing local governments and the like. Our other guest this evening is State Representative Richard Myers. He's a Democrat from Coralville, serving in his fourth term in the Iowa legislature. He's also a Democratic Majority Whip and very active in state politics. Art is a Republican. I might note that at the top. Some of you viewers may know that. I'd like to talk a little bit about what's on the agenda on June 29th, special election. There are two amendments, one basically limiting state spending at 99% of state revenues, something that is already in the state law, passed in 1992. It's a pretty good idea, and it's something in good economic times we've not had much problem dealing with. The other amendment that was passed is an amendment that basically would require 60% supermajority of the legislature to approve any income tax or sales tax or corporate tax increase, a 60% majority. Those two amendments had to be voted on by two different general assemblies and now go before the voters on a special election coming up very shortly on June 29th. The main proponent of these amendments has been a guy by the name of David Stanley from Muscatine, Iowa, who is involved with the Taxpayers United Political Action Committee and Iowans for Tax Relief, I think is the other organization they have. A man that's been on a mission for more than 20 years to basically see some sort of constitutional amendment be put in place that would limit the ability of state and at one point local governments to raise the resources they need to provide the services to people. Representative Myers, what's going on here? What's going to be happening in the coming weeks around these amendments?
Well, I hope there's a great deal of education that's going to be going on. We don't have much time left for the people in the state to understand precisely what these two amendments are about. In fact, that's, to me, a real flaw in the whole process. We got until June 29th to acquaint people with what's in these constitutional amendments. It's a very serious thing to do. It's one that can't be changed easily if something is wrong, and therein, to me, lies the real problem of what these two amendments are all about. And I'm hoping that people will look at them and make up their own mind and educate themselves about it.
Great. Art, do we need these amendments?
No, I think that's a big mistake. I don't think you put this kind of language in the Constitution. The Constitution should set out general principles, and then those principles can be carried out by the courts and by the legislature. This is fine. This language is fine in the code. It has no place in the Constitution. And I think it's going to be a real impediment for local governments and schools if they pass.
Mm-hmm. One of the underlying premises here is we can't trust elected officials to make decisions about how to manage our collective resources. Is that the case, Dick?
Well, certainly it was the case. It was certainly the case made to sell the idea of putting them on the ballot in the first place. That somehow there's a lack of trust involved. Somehow people who work for any sort of government institution, any sort of political subdivision, regardless of the task, is a person who cannot be trusted. I categorically reject that idea that somehow the government in the state of Iowa and the people of the state of Iowa are disconnected. I don't believe that for a minute. And I don't want, they use a pejorative term, tax eater, to describe someone who works for the government. A police officer, or a school teacher, or a person who fixes the streets. It's a tax eater. Somehow I just don't want to describe our public servants as that kind of a person. I believe that the people of Iowa are better than that and will reject that kind of philosophy.
So it seems like we're kind of in an anti-tax environment these days. There's been a number of local option sales tax votes in the state on both repairing schools and just general local option that have been overwhelmingly defeated. And in that environment, there seems to be a lot of support for this notion that we ought to have a 60% majority. What are going to be some of the problems created by that, and is that a realistic proposal?
Well, by putting a limitation on the income tax and the sales tax at the state level, it means that if funds are needed, you're going to raise it from other taxes and from fees. And what I see happening is that the state government will push functions off to local government, and then these will be funded by the property tax, which I think is if any of our taxes are out of line, it's the property tax. I don't think our sales tax is excessive. In fact, when I've seen it compared to other states, we're low. On the income tax, we're about average if you take into account the deduction of the federal income tax. And most of the people who are saying it's high say that the rates are high, but people that are just looking at rates don't understand that the federal deductibility reduces the effective rate. So I don't think our income tax is out of line. It's about average, and I think our sales tax is low. The property tax is the problem, and it impedes local governments because people are upset because they pay so much. The state should be sending more state money back as aid to cities and counties, as they do with schools.
Dick, is this going to be a shift in taxes?
Absolutely. It should be called the tax shift amendment. And you know, the proponents of these two constitutional amendments will tell you that in 13 other states, I believe it's now 14 states, that have adopted a supermajority amendment, that the property taxes have gone up at a slower rate. I'm not quite sure what that means, but the argument is false to begin with, because the property taxes in those other states are markedly different than they are in the state of Iowa. And there are two things that mark that out, that set that out. One is the way we fund education, and the other is the way we fund mental health. We do this differently than any other state in the union. So to compare property tax rates with other states simply is a false argument, and I don't believe it holds. In addition to that, our history, just going back 10 or 15 years, will tell you that when the state of Iowa got in some sort of financial bind, regardless of the reasons for it, what did they do? They pushed those costs back onto the local government. Why? Because state politicians don't levy property taxes. They don't get blamed when property taxes go up. So they just shove the costs back to the local governments. And they've done that time and time. We've done that time and time again. That is precisely what will happen if there's an economic downturn and state revenues can't cover the laws or the appropriations that they want to make. They'll push it to the local government, particularly in the areas of education.
Sure. I don't know what local governments are doing in other parts of the state, but here in Johnson County, our local governments need more resources to provide the services that constituents want. How are we going to deal with those kinds of unfunded mandates at the local level, Art?
There's going to be a lot of hostility. There is at the present time. What you see are more and more people are objecting, as you said, voting down special bond issues. I see them fighting property tax assessments. I think there's a lot of antagonism at the local level, and I think just exactly what we say is going to happen will happen. The state will run short of money, and they'll drop it back. And if I go back to 1965, which is when the state increased taxes to give property tax relief, so that today the state pays over 50% of the operating costs of the school systems. If you start back then and you adjust the dollar for inflation, the increase in state budgets is about 3% a year, which really isn't that bad. And when you see comparisons about what the state budget was in 64 or 65 and what it is today, you adjust it for inflation, and then you take into account that about 60% of that state budget comes back to local communities and schools. The increase at the state level has been almost nominal. Mm-hmm. And what David and his group do, they take actual dollars and they show an increase of like 60% from way back then, and they fail to tell you that David voted for the increases in 65 and 60 of the income tax and the sales tax because he wanted property tax relief. But now he's criticizing the very thing that he supported back then, and he uses a statistic to discredit state government and say that they're spendthrifts. I think it's hypocritical.
Another thing this does is it puts into place a system of minority rule. And we've had the one person, one vote by Supreme Court decision for almost 40 years now in this state, and this amendment, one of them that calls for a 60% majority, gives the power for 21 senators out of 150 state legislators to reject any sort of revenue source that the legislature might want or the governor might want. It's 14% of the legislature can control the actions of the rest of them. And I don't think that we want to turn over our government to 14% of our elected representatives. That means that a person who is a no vote on an issue is much more powerful than a person who is a yes vote on an issue by quite a bit. When you take into consideration that 21 senators can stop, that's 21 out of 50, can stop any revenue increase in the state budget. And I also would point out that I wonder where the need is for this amendment. You know, what's the crisis
Let's
here?
talk about that. What is the motivation in your minds about why we're doing this? It's such a bad idea. Part of it's already solved in the state code, the 99% limitation, 60% majority, the minority rule issue. What's the motivation here?
Well, some of it's just pandering for votes. They know people are unhappy about paying taxes, and so you say, I'm going to stop tax increases if you just vote for these amendments. And superficially, it's going to appeal to a lot of people, and then you can posture about the state that you're trying to lessen the tax burden on people. I think part of it's just political. It's hypocritical. I don't see much merit in it. And Iowa, as I said, since 1965 has been pretty responsible in terms of its state taxes.
Well, I think you need to look, when I say what is the need too, I agree with Art. How many times have we increased income tax? Can someone tell me when we've last increased the income tax in the state of Iowa? I think it goes back to 1972, if I'm not mistaken. And we've increased sales tax, I believe, twice since that time, and in the 80s. And the idea that income tax is all of a sudden going to go up, I think is ludicrous. One of the reasons why people are rejecting sales taxes, increases in this other part, is a distrust of government. I believe this kind of amendment fosters that distrust. If there's one thing I've learned as far as economic development is concerned in going to other parts of the world, is that you need to have a sense and a mutual trust between the academic community and the business community and the government community. And if you don't have that, you're not going to prosper. And we need to build trust, not build distrust. And this amendment, as far as I'm concerned, seems to say that the government is somehow our enemy. In the state of Iowa, I don't believe that's true at all.
Thanks. You're watching Iowa News and Views. We're about halfway through. We're talking about the constitutional amendments. We have a web page, like everybody does these days. You should check ours out. We've got some interesting things about past shows, upcoming shows, some pictures of our very handsome crew, and you can go look at those. Also, we have a web or an email address. If you've got ideas for guests or content, email them to us. We appreciate all the cards and letters and the email that we've been receiving from our viewers. Keep it coming. We like to get it. Our guests this evening are State Representative Richard Myers, is Democrat from Coralville, and Art New, former Lieutenant Governor, State Senator, and Mayor of Carroll, Iowa. And we're pleased to have them both with us. We're talking about the proposed changes to Iowa's Constitution coming up at a special election on June 29th. David Stanley and his organization have raised a pile of money to, over the last 6 years, contribute almost $750,000 to legislative candidates and legislators to basically get them to support this amendment. About $694,000 of those dollars went to Republicans, about $22,000 went to Democrats. Is he trying to buy his way into the Constitution with this kind of spending in this such focused way?
I don't know whether buying is correct or not. I guess you could say that. I'd say he's sort of threatening his way into the Constitution. I see the kind of pressure that's been brought upon moderate Republicans in the legislature, as well as moderate Democrats who are certainly fiscally responsible people and do not want to spend this state into oblivion under any circumstances. And I see that kind of attitude that he has, and it's almost threatening. People are actually, I think, in some ways politically terrorized by David Stanley and his methods as far as how elections are funded. And boy, they use that stuff against you in an election. I can tell you that as a person who's had that happen to him. But to me, it's unconscionable the amount of money that's been spent on trying to influence the legislative process.
I was on a panel with David last week, and he told me that they were going to spend over $1 million on just this campaign. That's not for people.
Right.
This is just for this issue. So you know that he's very much determined, and he does have the money. I don't think the people and the groups that oppose this amendment can even begin to muster the kind of financial resources that he has.
Well, he was the number one of all the PACs in the state that 6-year period. He contributed, his organization, the Taxpayers United, contributed more than any other PAC, and some fairly sizable amounts of money to individual legislators.
I'd like to raise another issue, if you don't mind, about this. It's sort of a esoteric issue in a way. It's sort of almost abstract. But one of the things that we've always prided ourselves in this state and in this country is a balance of power between the gubernatorial branch, or that is the executive branch, and the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. This amendment shifts power toward a few people in the legislature, away from the executive branch, and indeed away from the majority of the legislature itself. It is a marked shift in the way things are done in this state. And I'm not sure we have any need to do that whatsoever. Not only putting power into a small amount of hands in case of stopping something, like I mentioned earlier, but right now the appropriations process in our Constitution, and I invite people to read Article 3, Section 15 of our Iowa Constitution. It's not very long, it's easy to read, and it tells you precisely what the legislators' duties are about appropriating funds and what the governor's duties are. And this amendment would change that. It would mean that in order to spend reserve funds, simply put now, it would mean in order to spend reserve funds that the legislature now has, about $400 million worth, the legislature would not need the governor's approval. Would not need the governor's approval on an appropriations process. Now that, to me, is a shift in power. And I don't believe we ought to allow that whatsoever. I think that's a major flaw.
That's a good point, Dick. So we know David Stanley and his organization pushing forward. Who's opposed to this, these amendments right now? What organizations have lined up and said this is a bad idea?
Many consumer groups have opposed this, as well as, I believe, education organizations, the Iowa State Association of Counties, the League of Municipalities, because they see a shift toward property taxes. They say, I've heard it said that this amendment doesn't affect local government. Yes, it does. It certainly does. And it would place a burden on their ability to do the things that the state mandates them to do and the federal government mandates them to do. So that means it's a shift. So those organizations that would feel the financial pressure of this amendment certainly have opposed it. And there are actually quite a list. Many labor organizations as well.
I noted a few of those: the Iowa Library Association, the Iowa Professional Firefighters, League of Women Voters, State Police Officers Council, a lot of folks that work for local governments.
League of Cities,
League of Cities.
ISCA,
Okay.
the School Board Association. They're all opposed to it, and with good cause. I don't understand why the Farm Bureau is supporting it. They backed off on David's original amendment, the Taxpayers' Rights Amendment. They backed off. They supported it back in '80, and then they backed off and didn't support it in the '98 legislative session. But now they're supporting this, and it strikes me that for an organization that's concerned about property tax relief, the adoption of these amendments will result in functions being shifted to local government and more property tax. It doesn't make any sense to me how they've come down like that.
Let's talk about the June 29th, the timing of this election. Dick, I know you didn't support this when it was voted on this year. I didn't either. In terms of setting the election, there was an argument made that we ought to vote on this at a general election when you got a good turnout. People said, no, we can't do that. It was pretty much a partisan vote on we're going to hold that election. What's the politics of that June 29th election?
I called it one of a very rigged vote. First of all, legislator, you have two constitutional amendments. They have to be voted on separately. The Constitution says that if you're going to amend it, you can only have one subject be in an amendment. You can't have two subjects. So there are two amendments here, and each citizen that goes to the polls is going to vote on them separately. The legislature was not allowed that luxury. We had to vote on both of those amendments as part of one joint resolution, which meant that they really didn't get the kind of scrutiny that they should have had. In fact, many legislators might have wanted to support one or the other, or might have wanted to amend one or the other. That wasn't allowed. So the process was really rigged, in my judgment, to get through. In addition to that, we put this amendment in here so that we're going to have the election on the 29th of June, when barely a third of the normal electorate will have the opportunity to vote because they'll be gone or they don't even know about it. And I think the article you saw in the newspaper this weekend proves that. that 86% are not even aware that there's going to be a major change to the Iowa Constitution decided on the 29th day of June.
Go ahead.
I would point out that I believe there have been 47 amendments to the Iowa Constitution, and all but 3 of them have, I know my number might be 1 or 2 off, but I know that all but 3 of them have been voted upon in a November election. And these people who talk about trying to save folks money are going to spend at least $1.5 to $1.8 million to hold a special election that they wouldn't have to spend if it was held in November when most people vote. That, to me, is the height of political cynicism. They're trying to sneak it past the Iowa voters.
Sure,
That's exactly what they're doing.
The number you cite is a Cedar Rapids Gazette poll from this past weekend, May 16th, that said 86% of Iowans weren't aware that we're going to have this election.
See, in 1980, they couldn't get the Taxpayers' Rights Amendment through the legislature back then, so what they did was to have a statewide vote to hold a constitutional convention, which we do every 10 years. And so the issue was to try to get a convention and pass it at the convention. And on that vote, they lost decisively. And basically, it was a vote over the Taxpayers' Rights Amendment, and 56 or so percent voted no. We don't want a convention for that purpose. And so they're afraid to take it on head-to-head in a November election. They feel that they're better organized than the opponents and that they can get their people out on June 29th and win with a distinct minority. And I think it's a real threat. We have to be aware of that and try to marshal our forces.
You know, I believe this is about the 15th or 16th version of the so-called Stanley Amendment. We call this one the legislature Stanley Light because it's a little bit shorter than the rest of them. But these are amazing documents. It's one of the it would be the longest amendment to our Iowa Constitution. It's some 2,000 words if we were to put that in there. And the Constitution, as Art mentioned earlier, is a fairly general document. But all I can think about is that if those previous 15 different amendments that were going to be put on the Iowa Constitution, or in the Iowa Constitution, they were all found to be flawed in some way, shape, or form. Some of them had grammatical errors, for heaven's sakes. And it makes me wonder, what if we'd adopted one of those things that was supposed to be the end-all to this particular process and was supposed to be so right? You don't put fiscal policy that might need to be changed for whatever reason in the Constitution. As Art said, you put it in the statute. That's where it belongs.
So
Well, in 1980, again, when David came up with his first proposal, he told us that it was drafted by the leading economists and tax authorities of the state. He changed it just a few years later, and then he changed it again for the 1998 session. Now, I haven't compared every version, but you compare the 1980 version with the most recent version, and the sections aren't even the same. So what was perfect in 1980 required numerous changes, and it's just ludicrous. I wish people would sit down and read these things and realize that even though the proponents think they know what it means, by the time the courts, the legislature, and the lawyers get done with it, it's going to be a nightmare. They're simply incomprehensible, particularly the TRA, the Taxpayers' Rights Amendment. I've read that several times, and I'll be darned if I understand it, and I defy anybody that thinks they understand it to be able to say for sure that that's what the courts will hold or what the effects are going to be of these. This is not the kind of thing that you put in the Constitution. If it's in the code, you can change it. The trouble is that these people want to lock their preconceived notions in the Constitution where we're all going to be bound by them. And if I were in the legislature and I wanted to program funded, I'd have to come up with another tax other than income or sales tax, a value-added tax. And that's not covered by this thing.
Right.
It's a terrible thing, and the legislature, if it wants, will get around it.
the gas tax is
Yeah.
another tax not included
Inheritance
in this.
tax,
That's
estate tax,
Okay,
use tax. Well, they got the use tax in there.
right. Dick?
One of the things that it will do, by the way, is it will foster legislation that would put in place special funds or special taxes for special funds, like the road use tax, earmarking, in other words. One of the things the legislature has always rejected is the idea of earmarking money for a special need, because needs change. But this kind of thing will force that to get around it. And I think that's totally wrong. Every issue, whether it's education or mental health or anything the general fund does, should go into that great melting pot, if you will, of monies and fight their way through the appropriating process and be judged on their merits. They shouldn't have earmarked dollars, because that will definitely cause taxes to go up, and it'll cause money to be spent needlessly on things that may not have any need whatsoever.
We're down there. We're down to the last 2 minutes. What's your advice to people looking at this and thinking about going to the polls on it?
I think they ought to get copies of both of them and read them, the whole thing, and then they ought to vote no on both of them. They're going to make it very difficult for state government, and more particularly for local government to function effectively. It's going to be a nightmare, and I hope people turn out and vote no.
Dick?
Well, clearly it shifts power. It also shifts the tax burden. Those are things that I think people need to remember. I certainly want people to get a whole copy of the amendment. They can get it on the computer on the website and read them and try to understand them and study them. There's an old saying in the Iowa legislature, if you don't know, vote no. And I think that certainly applies here. I want to use an analogy briefly if I can. A few years ago we had an equal rights amendment that most people seemed to favor, but folks thought it was too complicated and didn't belong in the Iowa Constitution, and they rejected it. And then along came another amendment on equal rights. It said, and women. Very easy to understood, and it passed right through. And it wasn't a complicated document. I think this thing is way too complicated to be in our Constitution, but I urge people to study it, and I also would hope they'd vote no, but they've got to make up their own minds.
Good. I did go to their website, David Stanley's website. I couldn't find the language. I don't know if it's hidden there or they don't want people to see it or not. I hope our local newspapers will publish this leading up
Well, they will
to
be
days
required to publish it. They ought to be.
coming up at the end, and people will get an opportunity to see it. I'd like to thank Art New and Richard Myers, Representative Myers, for being with us to talk about this. I'm going to sign on too as saying I don't think we ought to muck up the Constitution with these two amendments. I think that's better left as public policy matters in the state code. Constitution is something we ought to keep our principles in, not these day-to-day public policies. We're glad you joined us. Remember, the Iowa News and Views is just a TV program. What's important is what you're doing in your community each and every week to make it a better place. We've got a couple folks here working hard. You get out there and do the same. We'll see you next time. Thanks.